Welcome to Winning Words, a celebration of the winners of the annual BLR Literary Prizes. I'm Danielle Ofri, Editor-in-Chief of Bellevue Literary Review. We're so glad you can join us. This right here is the 48th issue of BLR, and it's packed with amazing fiction, poetry, and nonfiction, plus gorgeous cover art by Elisa Nissenbaum. This year, we received almost 900 submissions for the BLR Literary Prizes. And for today's reading and conversation, we're going to start with fiction. BLR's Goldenberg Prize for Fiction was judged by Weissman Moore, and the winner is the story The Veil Thins by Fiona Ennis. Honorable mention is the story Bushmeat by Chinaecherem Obor. Fiona will start us off by reading an excerpt of her story The Veil Thins, then she'll be joined by BLR's associate fiction editor, Lauralee Leonard. They'll be followed by Chinaecherem reading an excerpt of his honorable mention story Bushmeat.
My name is Fiona Ennis, and this is an excerpt from my story, The Veil Thins. And I'm going to start reading from a few pages into the story. And in this scene, we encounter Sister Annunziata, a young midwife and nun. Late that night, Sister Annunziata slipped out of the convent and cycled down the tree-flocked avenue onto the street. Even though the street lamps were on, she had no choice but to put on her bike lamp, especially after what had happened before. She hoped no one would notice her, although it would have been hard to miss her, the veil perched on her head, the back of it flapping as she pedalled. Down the street she passed no one at all, and by the time she reached the narrow country road that she'd have to cycle on for 4 miles, she almost wished she'd seen someone. She'd never cycled this late at night, enveloped by blackness, apart from what her little lamp lit up. In the distance, she heard a rumble and soon saw headlights. A truck, almost as wide as the road, was thundering along. She jumped off her bike and pulled it as far as she could into the brambles, ignoring the thorns digging into her through her cardigan and tights, concentrating instead on nudging the light to make sure the bike was visible, that she was visible. Shakily, she reached under the cloth that was covering the contents in the front basket of her bike. The holy water was there, along with the crucifix. Maybe it wasn't a good idea, but she had to try. She could still hear the howls from Sarah earlier in the day, the low, blood-churning howls as if the entrails of the earth itself were being eviscerated. She got back onto the bike and started pedaling, still a little wobbly, straining her ears to hear if anything else big was coming. She thought she was over this. She cycled her bike every day, for goodness sake. And even if the worst happened, there was nothing to be afraid of. Quite the opposite. She knew this, but trying to reason her way out of what she was feeling wasn't working. Maybe her body was trembling because that was where the memory really resided. The evening it had happened, it had not been as dark, but it had been dusk, just at that point where silhouettes loom large and shapes meld into the landscape. Weeks afterwards, she had tried to comfort the farmer whose tractor had clipped her bike and thrown her onto the road. Even after she'd told him she was recovering well, he'd still looked haunted. She was haunted too. What she'd seen in the aftermath of the accident, she couldn't unsee, and it was infiltrating everything. She was strangely soothed by it, and she didn't want to unsee. She remembered being pulled along, but not along the road or the floor of the operating room. She was being tugged somewhere unearthly, towards a radiant light source, the same colour as those long fluorescent white lights that buzzed in the kitchen of the convent. But this light was from no bulb. It radiated all around, then held her close in its energy, and she felt as if she was actually curled up on the outside of love. She felt herself slipping away from it, and no matter how she grasped and clutched, she couldn't hold fast. The light was melting away, and she knew this was not the first time this had happened. This had all happened before her birth, and she hadn't wanted to leave that space, that light, that time either. But here she was again, wrenched away, and this time she wasn't deposited into Mam's arms. After a long stint in hospital, she hadn't been allowed to convalesce at home with her family. She'd had to go back to the convent. No other choice was entertained. It was still dark by the time she reached Tom Hogan's farm. Annunziata put the crucifix and holy water in a little net bag and knocked on the door. Tom gestured her in, and she was glad of the warmth of the house and the yellow light. "Would you like a cup of tea, sister?" Tom shifted from foot to foot on the brown lino. "Would you rather get on with it? It won't be long until it's light." "I think we'll just press on, Tom. Sarah's here. She's in the bathroom." She could hear someone in the hall, and she looked out the kitchen door, thinking she'd see Sarah. But it was Tom's wife, Rose, creeping across the grey flagstones. She glanced at Annunziata, fearful, then went into a bedroom and closed the door. "Rose doesn't think what we're doing is right, sister. Doesn't think you should be meddling with this kind of stuff. Especially not on our land. Thank you."
To give our listeners a little bit more context of the story, although I think that is the very center of the story that you shared with us, we see Sister Annunziata in the beginning as a young sister who sees herself, or is beginning to see herself, as somewhat different from the other sisters in the story. And as the story progresses, we get the sense that at every juncture, she struggles with where her conscience is pulling her, and against the rules of the life that she has embraced. I'm wondering how this story came about for you.
Yeah, this story came about when I visited my brother's farm and I saw the Colleen there. And a Colleen is a place where people are buried who aren't allowed to be buried on consecrated church ground. So, for example, babies who died before they were baptized, so stillbirths. And in Catholic church teaching for a really long time, babies who died before they were baptized were seen as not gaining direct access to heaven, were seen as being languishing in limbo. And so visually, when I saw the Colleen, what I saw was the space under this beautiful hawthorn tree. So it has this really gnarled bark. It's a really ancient tree. There was beautiful, delicate white flowers. And it was also beside a stream, signifying the passage, between the two worlds, between this physical material world and this otherworldly realm as well. And so I knew I wanted to write about the Colleen, but I wasn't sure who was the character in the story, and I wasn't sure what the story actually was. And then sometime later, I was walking on Clonea Strand in Waterford, where I live, and I saw this tiny silver fish head, and it was beautiful. It looked like a piece of jewelry, just a head, no body. And I began to think about this particular figure of Sister Annunziata, this young nun who's a midwife, who is always in her head, just constantly in her head, and doesn't nearly even feel like she has a body. She's so preoccupied with thoughts pertaining to her faith and questions regarding her faith, but also questions about the otherworldly realm as well. And then when I had this figure of Annunziata and I had the Colleen, it created this impetus and this drive for me to write. And so once I had those two together, the story came readily, not necessarily easily, but it came readily, and it still required quite a good bit of work afterwards. But it came quite readily then.
That's so interesting. One of the things that really struck me about this story was that the major three scenes of the story take place in the natural world. The opening is on a deserted beach, then Sister Annunziata's in the water, then the long bike ride at night, and the reference to a previous bike ride, and then she arrives at the farm, and then they progress to a field. And in so many other Irish authors, the land, the countryside, the water, the stream, the brook, they exert a power, it seems, over the characters or onto the characters. It's almost like a transformational effect. And I'm wondering how you see the natural world working with your three characters.
Yeah, I see the natural world as being really important, particularly for the figure of Annunziata, actually, because at that particular time, when we meet her on the beach, She is so in her head. She's preoccupied with questions pertaining to her faith, what she sees happening particularly to women and children under the auspices of and under the constraints of Catholicism as it was back then, where there were great restrictions on women's autonomy and agency. And she sees this both as a nun and also as a midwife. So she's grappling with that. She's also grappling with ideas pertaining to the afterlife and what she has seen as a result of her near-death experience. And so she is going swimming to try to shed the day. Like the beach is important for Annunziata because it's the only place that she feels like she's really in her body. It's the only place where she feels like she's actually earthed. And so she tries to shed the day, but I think there's also recognition for Annunziata that should she be trying to shed the day? Should she be trying to rid herself of these questions? And then we meet her on the bike. And why I kind of wanted to have the bike there was because, and have her journey on the bike was because, again, because she's so much in her head, but she's had this near-death experience. And so she completely feels the fear in her body. And she tries to rationalize it to herself and say, I have slipped into this otherworldly realm and I don't think there's anything to fear, but yet she feels the physical fear in her body when she's on this dark bike ride at night and she hears this vehicle coming and she is scared and she's nervous, and this is a bodily thing that she feels. And then when we reach the farm is of particular significance for her because she also grew up on a farm. And she doesn't have Wellington boots anymore. She has to borrow Rose's Wellington boots. But I feel the farm is a place of return for Annunziata, a coming home in some respects. And also the image of the hawthorn was important to me as well. The hawthorn is a tree that can live for hundreds of years. And on this particular farm, Tom's farm, and this farm setting is so important, for Tom as well. It's a place where people have buried those who couldn't be buried on consecrated ground for a very long time. And it actually is going back further than the famine, he says. So I like the idea of this tree standing as an emblem of the natural world, bearing witness to the transformations that happen, seeing the tragedy, but seeing everything that happens kind of under its watch, as always being there and always enduring while yet transforming as well at the same time.
Oh, thank you for that. And I so love that expression, a place of return. That is just so beautiful.
Thank you.
What's up next for you? Is the short story the perfect form for you in terms of your fiction interests? And also, I'm curious as to how the two parts of your work life, your fiction writing and your lecturing in English literature and philosophy, work together, or if there's some special magic that you use to keep them fresh in both cases.
Yeah, so I love the short story form. I love the art of it. I love the practice of it. I love the way in which it holds great tension, and that you try to sustain that tension. I remember hearing Claire Keegan talk before about the incision in time. So she's an Irish writer, Claire Keegan, and she spoke about the way that in a short story you start as late as you can and you start in a place of rising tension. And I love that idea within the short story that you are in a place of escalating tension and that you're trying to hold the reader, in that space. And I also like that with a great short story, often the effect can resound for much longer than the actual time reading it, that the effect can echo for a much longer period afterwards. So I love that about the form of the story. And then in terms of how the aspects then relate to my lecturing job in Southeast Technological University in Waterford, Ireland. So I lecture in literature and philosophy there, and I'm delighted to be able to do so. And it's great, really, I suppose, for me, because my fiction predominantly is philosophical in terms of the kinds of things that I like to grapple with. In particular, I like to grapple with moral issues, but also I have a tendency to examine other areas of philosophical interest as well for me. Like, for example, in this story, this idea of like the nature of consciousness, different planes of consciousness, these kinds of ideas, I suppose, The stories then reflect my concerns and my preoccupations and my interests as well. So it's lovely to be able to combine those elements together, you know.
Well, thank you again for that. And I have another phrase to take home for myself, rising tensions in the short story. That's wonderful. And I want to thank you and wish you very good luck as the future unfolds for you.
Thank you so much, Lauralee. I really enjoyed this.
It's been a pleasure.
I have been thinking of shame. It's like seeking absolution, this pulsing urge to recount to someone, anyone, all the shames of my life. It was only shame I felt as my father folding quietly into the ground like prey met by a hunter's bullet. But it was the butt of a gun that hit his temple. And there is even more shame in dying from the wrong end of a gun. I am sitting on a bench in the university's main quad, the sun melting some of the desperation that has kicked in 3 weeks after my arrival as my body continues to resist the laws of US Central Standard Time. Will you look at that? The woman beside me says as she positions her phone to take a picture. That little one is a real hoarder. So much cover means there's food stashed underneath. Her eyes attend the squirrel like a parent watching their child play at the park. Do you think he knows what life is like for squirrels in other parts of the world? She continues. I take a first real look at her. She has a Ziploc bag and from it fishes a handful of assorted nuts, pecans, almonds, walnuts, cashews. These she hauls singly and ceremonially at the base of the squirrel's hip. The little animal eats a couple of walnuts and mostly ignores the cashews. I can admit some curiosity about what her thoughts concerning foreign squirrels are. This tall white woman sitting here with a public bag of unsalted mixed nuts trying to feed a rodent. You remember the Ghana visit I mentioned in class? She asks. She must not have been expecting an answer to her earlier question. What class? I'm pretty sure it was you this morning in colonial history. No? With Nico, Dr. Harris. Yeah, I said to this white woman on the bench. I was there. Did you know they eat squirrels in Ghana? She asked. In my ex-boyfriend's hometown, his cousins would bring back these little animals for food. I'm talking rabbits, squirrels, and stuff. They'll bring them back with their heads bashed in. I think they hunted them with stones. Some of them were brought in alive, just wounded or stunned, and they would make these sweet-smelling soups with the animal flesh. Oh, they smelled so good. But all that death, it was all I could think about. I couldn't believe it. After he paused, I couldn't believe it either when he dumped my ass in a foreign country and I had to fly back here on my own. A flight of shame. She chuckles. Is it an American pastime to hawk one's embarrassments, to peddle the small tragedies of one's life to strangers? People eat dog meat where I'm from, I finally say. Say what now? We eat dog meat in my hometown. She is waiting for me to laugh it off. I show her it's a joke, the way her body pitches forward from the bench's recline, looking at me. Then she leans back and munches her nuts. After she leaves, I open WhatsApp and video call my oldest friend. Obumdeme listens quietly as I offer my theory on the great American loneliness. American babies sitting in trolleys and wide-eyed towards the world are bundled through the bricklet locomotion of free enterprise, their parents' feet tap-tapping behind them. Lacking the assurance of constant bodily touch, deprived of the soft security of a sibling's back or a father's shoulder, they grow up with unsteady feet, their adult bodies grasping at other bodies for balance. Obumdeme is not impressed. Her face is pixelated on the screen and the white blurs of her eyes are clear with attention. My boy, she says in a voice slow and past, like we are not the same age and she has some great insight. I think you're just lonely. No shit. thousands of miles from home. People here are so lonely. It's almost perverse. And it's not like they have no friends or their family is in some other country, stuff like that. It's like the thing they need to feel that loneliness doesn't even exist. She whispers, "You should probably stop dunking on Americans while in public." Neme, we are speaking Igbo. If a random white person here understands Igbo, there must be something very wrong about them. Obum Neme chuckles. Just be careful. You are not in Nsukka anymore.
Thank you, Fiona. Thank you, Lauralee. And thank you, Chinaecherem. We now turn to poetry. This year, BLR's John and Eileen Allman Prize for Poetry was judged by Layla Motley. The winner is the poem Cleaver by Sandra Dolores Gomez Amador. Honorable mention went to the poem Hard to Face the Day by Cedric Rudolph. We'll start with Sandra reading her winning poem Cleaver, and then she'll be joined in conversation with BLR's assistant poetry editor Saleem Hugh Penny. This will be followed by Cedric reading his honorable mention poem Hard to Face the Day.
Cleaver. I do not think about flesh anymore, but if I did, I will tell you about its adoration for cruelty. How my grandfather clenched firmly on my wrist the first time I held a cleaver to wound. How we killed them together, and when it bleated loudly, I bit my tongue till it bled. How he then placed his hand tenderly against my cheek before sinking his nails into it. How he repented instinctively, cried out, "Perdóname, perdóname, corderita." How I was a witness of his violence, but a bearer of it too, and to bear is itself a way of devotion. How when he died, I wailed at his feet, repeating, "Yo también quiero aprender a ser cruel." How I have always longed to be the butcher's favorite animal to slaughter.
Sandra, thank you so much for that incredible reading. You accomplished so much in these couplets. And when I read it the first time, what I'm doing right now, that's what I did. It was this deep breath of holding so much tension across it and not knowing where we were going to go, but having a feeling I'd probably end up in a different space by the time I concluded. There are a few lines in particular that are still sticking with me, in no particular order. How we killed a lamb together, hand tenderly against my cheek before sinking his nails into it, a witness of his violence, but a bearer of it too, and to bear itself is a way of devotion. I'm curious, so much what stuck out to me is this juxtaposition of compassion and cruelty. Wondering if you can talk a little bit about how that shows up in this piece, as well as any of your other work. Perhaps we could start there.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for all your kind words. They mean a lot. Well, this is part of a bigger project, and my book is called Carnassial, which is the name of a tooth that animals have when they are carnivores, and it's used to chew through meat. And the whole project is about this figure of a grandfather who is a butcher and a girl who is growing up with in this butchery. I am from Mexico. I was born and raised there, and I just came to the US to do my master's. And for me, it was really important to portray this kind of tradition of the butchery, especially I think the idea of tenderness and violence together, because I think the rituals and the traditions of slaughter are very different in places like Mexico and the global South and here. So I do wanted to use the figure of the grandfather to show some kind of violence that was inherited. I would call it inherited aggression, and then how the speaker deals with that violence through, I guess, she in a way looks up to her grandfather and to the figure of this butcher. So those two are, in juxtaposition in the poem.
Wow. Inherited, you said, did you say inherited aggression? What is the word you said? Yeah, that phrase is going to stick with me. I'm from South Carolina, and my granddad was a sharecropper in sort of numerous agricultural spaces. And I remember watching a chicken and watching animals, but not participating in the slaughter. So this is very powerful that you were really looking at the tradition of that and sort of not shying away like our meat just appears in a grocery store.
Yeah.
I'm curious about the grandfather connection in particular, because as I was reading this poem, it was really exciting that I could see the speaker as a 5-year-old, as a 10-year-old, as a 15-year-old, as a 25-year-old, right? And sort of, I know that a great deal of your work is centered in a feminist tradition, and I'm kind of curious about the way that gender may or may not be a factor in this poem across the lifespan.
Yeah, I think that the gender dynamics come into play in this poem and all throughout this collection. And especially in places like a butchery, it is often thought of women as just doing maybe more of the cleaning kind of work instead of the butchering. And I did not want, as you said, to shy away from that. I wanted this figure to be present, but at the same time, to do hold this tension between killing and between being a witness of it. I actually have another poem with the line, I am not cruel in the ways that men are. I bathe the bones under the stream of the river. So just a little bit on just a little bit about how being a woman also speaks to these traditions of murder and slaughter and taking care of the animals that you kill. So that was important also in the poem, and it's important all throughout the collection.
Thank you. I'm excited for this collection, by the way. I didn't know we were going to get blessed with like a full preview, so I'm very excited. You have a piece in 2021 called Descriptive Diagnosis in a poetry newspaper from the National Autonomous University of Mexico. And it really struck me as a disabled poet, thinking a lot about visible and invisible disabilities, immunocompromised, individual. And so there's a line in there where you say, your body, a contradictory entity, symptomatic polymorphism. And that really stuck with me. Again, coming back a little bit to Cleaver and sort of seeing these layers of witnessing. I know another piece I read of yours, you talk specifically about migraines and sort of looking at migraines from a feminist perspective. That's an older piece in 2020. And kind of, I'm curious about this notion that you could say all pain is invisible, and kind of where that sits with you, how that continues to show up, in this more current recent work.
Yeah, actually, those were some of my first publications back home in Mexico. As I was writing these creative pieces, I was also working on my thesis for my undergrad, which was about how female pain is invisible in Blue Eggs by Maggie Nelson. And I do think that there has been a tradition of ignoring the pain of women, especially women of color. And I think I wanted to kind of shed a light on that. I think that, for example, when we talk about migraines, we cannot really see the pain that another person is suffering, and that was important for me to put in my work. And I think my work before was more about the body and about illness, and the body and illness are present also in my new work too. But I think it's more from a feminist framework, like you said, but also this part of tradition and embodied memory, and how the pain that others have felt in the place that we inhabit sometimes can be inherited.
Thank you so much. Can we talk about language a little bit? I appreciate you mentioning the Mexican pride is clear throughout your work, and printing in bilingual publications seems pretty important. And I'm really curious how, I always love talking about this. What are your perspectives on if you're writing for a primarily English-speaking audience and showing translations or not showing translation? This is like the hot take part of the interview. What's your hot take on that? I'm curious.
Yeah, actually, my thesis that I just defended, I have all the poems in English and Spanish next to each other, because I do came here with the idea of multilingualism to be part of my project. So most of these poems that I have written and Cleaver, I did write in English first, but I wanted to keep the language of the dialogues because all the dialogues in this poem are in Spanish. I wanted for it to feel authentic to the figures that are in there. So the grandfather and the butchery are in Mexico. So it was important for me to keep that authenticity of where this is taking place, because I do think that the idea of a butchery or like a butchery may be perceived different, and like the traditions and the things that happen in there in Mexico versus the US or other parts of the world. So I am a big fan of sometimes not providing translations for those kinds of lines, because I think that the readers should do kind of that work to discover what's going on. But I also I think that I provide that translation at the end of the poem instead of in the poem, so readers can have access to it. But at the same time, you can keep those words the way that the way that they were said before.
That's incredible. And the hot take, I'm with you there. Definitely on, it's a question of cultural authenticity. It's a question of access, right? We're in a time where, Google Translate can just sit right off to the side, but then recognizing it's not just about the words, right? Like there's certain idioms and certain expressions that an AI translator, isn't going to get. So I really appreciate that decision to not, it doesn't feel like you assumed who your audience was, and that's really nice. And I've seen some of your poems are in all Spanish, and then that's kind of a great feeling for me, not being a native Spanish speaker, to be like, okay, cool. Like maybe this poem was a little bit for me, maybe it wasn't, and like that's okay. I think a lot about code switching, a lot about if I'm writing in this space, what I can say, in this space, what I can say. So I'm just excited from the BLR perspective when we get an opportunity to see somebody thinking so intentionally about language and how it's showing up in their work. I'm really excited in our mutual interest around Blackout poetry, and I've seen this cool little corner in Instagram where you have redaction and blackout and collage, and I'm so curious if there are any connections between the current work you're doing and how it fits with some of this blackout redaction work.
Yes, I have my Instagram account for Blackout Poetry. And what I do mainly with that one is that I take texts that have been kind of hurting my community. For example, the DMS5, or texts that talk about Mexicans, and then I turn it into poetry. I think it is important that when we think about Blackout poetry, to recognize which are the people that we are taking the work from, right? Because there are some people that just take any kind of work by any poet and do the blackout poem. And while I do appreciate that, I think it is also important to recognize who we are silencing and who we are not. So that has been very important for my work. And the way that I have been doing it is by taking texts that have been hurting my community. And I do think that it has some kind of relationship with the cultural aspect of my poetry now, but it's definitely like something that I do think as separate. But yeah, I think that if anything, like the thing that puts everything together would be like the cultural aspect of it.
That's incredible. Thank you. I would love to collaborate someday, especially hearing how you think about your source text. That intentionality is well appreciated. So again, I just want to publicly acknowledge and give gratitude for the time I was able to spend with the 2025 winner of the John and Eileen Allman Prize for Poetry. Sandra, thank you so much for your time. Hugest congratulations from the whole Bellevue literary community.
Thank you, Saleem. Thank you to everyone who's watching this interview, and thank you for reading my work and for being here with me.
Thanks so much.
I get down to Mavis Staples. The backbone meets metal. My heart sweats as if in church. I called out, well, when the preacher tilted his body at 45 degrees after riffing off James 2:14. He wiped sweat from his brow. Yes, saints. Don't nobody need to prod you to holler from a kept place inside. Might just save me on days when I can't muster I want to smell the buttery earth. On days I shut my eyes and see only my own self. I put on 99 and a half. That church boy rhythm might just save me when I ain't got no more come hither or oh Father who arts. My might sizzles on a stove. My innocence freezes in an ice block. But Jesus is on the main line. So I sing that chorus with Mavis's contralto voice. I need that spirit that sweeps up gay church boys. I can't join the ones who went down by their own hand. I have work to do, O Lord, in this unkempt world, greased over. This world and dirtied us in its wake.
Thank you, Sandra. Thank you, Saleem. And thank you, Cedric. Last but definitely not least is nonfiction. BLR's Felice Buckfar Prize for Nonfiction was judged by Esme Weijin Wang, and the winner is the essay Every Day Anew by Pia Jee-Hae Baur. Honorable mention is the essay Caged by Liesel Hamilton. We'll start with Pia reading an excerpt from her essay Every Day Anew. She will then be joined by BLR's assistant nonfiction editor, Alanna Weissman. This will be followed by Liesel reading an excerpt from her honorable mention essay, Caged.
I wrote about my experience managing my epilepsy and the darker family history that exists behind me having this condition. And so I'll be reading two segments briefly about my experiences when I end up going to the doctor's office and the way that my history includes my father when I'm dealing with my medical condition. So here's the first one. I dislike switching doctors, primarily because every time I have to recount my medical history, I have to decide how much I should lie. When I was a child, my mother would do this for me. She would say that the scar tissue in my brain was from when she accidentally dropped me as an infant. I uncovered the truth decades later, but for years I parroted the story that my mother had made up. It was only in 2018 that I, for the first time, told my new neurologist that my seizures were the result of abusive head trauma I suffered as a baby. I recounted as casually as I could that the perpetrator was my father, and then I plowed ahead and told her everything else in clinical detail. My hospitalizations, anticonvulsant drugs I'd failed, surgical evaluations, losing my driver's license, knocking myself unconscious in the shower, nearly dropping out of college. She began to tilt her head as I spoke, and by the time I was done, her ear was nearly touching her shoulder. So you didn't grow up with your father, she said. But I did. I grew up with the man who nearly killed me. And then from the bottom, bringing it full circle, another doctor's visit and my reflection after. I once asked my neurologist why she chose to specialize in epilepsy. She smiled beatifically as her eyes looked far away. Because the brain is where we live, she said. This same neurologist also told me that aside from falling on the side of highly unlikely statistics, my case of epilepsy is perfectly ordinary. I have scar tissue in my left temporal and occipital lobes from where my father injured my brain. I was young enough that surrounding neurons took over the cognitive functions of the damaged brain cells. I turned out normal, so normal that my parents were able to pretend nothing had ever happened. A thought often repeated by my father was that my epilepsy had come out of nowhere and it might disappear as suddenly as it came, even when imaging tests and EEGs consistently identified the scar tissue as the culprit of all my epileptic episodes. In 2024, I was referred to another new neurologist and found myself looking through my family history again and picking up my father's diary for the first time in years. I had read it all the way through only once, then stowed it away in various places. I've moved more than a dozen times, taking it with me across 3 different states, but never brought myself to reread it. As I was unpacking for my most recent move, it occurred to me that there was an irony to the idea of starting every day anew. If I were trying to exercise compassion by reading my father's thoughts to understand him, does that mean I should give him a blank slate, a figurative new day? And isn't that what I had already been doing every time we pretended that nothing had happened? It is easier to love people when love is not prescribed. It would be easier to love my father if he weren't my father. If I could love him the way that we love all those who enter our lives and imprint themselves on us because we allow them, it would all be much simpler. I want so badly to be one of those neighborhood kids. I want to be the kid who's fascinated by the man who unicycles to work. I want to be the neighbor impressed by the man who farms a plot of land in the South Bay and gives away his extra zucchini and sunchokes. I want to be the colleague who admires the man who takes things apart in his garage just so he can understand all the moving parts. I want to be the next door teen awed by the man who rides down to Mexico whenever he feels like it. I want to be anyone to him but his daughter.
Thank you for sharing that with us. So our contest judge, Esme Wei-Jun Wang, who selected your work as the winner of our contest, wrote, "By the end, I felt a profound sympathy for both the writer and the father, despite his actions, a remarkable achievement." So how did you approach that in writing this piece, and how were you able to pull that off?
When I wrote this, I was not entirely sure yet if I was going to focus on my medical condition, epilepsy, or some of the dysfunction from my childhood that circles around my father and that dark family history that I didn't find out until decades later. But when I did get going, I decided to approach it a little bit as a character study of my father. And the thing is, even though this contest was about the medical condition, about my narrative, I can't write about him without writing about my epilepsy and vice versa. The two are so inextricably linked. And my goal was not to vilify him, because one of the things that stands out about my dad as a person is that he really is a very singular man. And so I wanted to write it as a character study. I stepped back from the situation, from the history, and I wanted to look at him as plainly as possible, as anyone else might look at him, anyone else who might have found his diary and not known about it, not known about him as a father. So for me, a character study is how I approached it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really interesting because I know in your piece you write about, you mentioned how maybe your memories might be unreliable, how pieces of information are missing, how you don't necessarily have the full story. How were you able to synthesize all that and bring that all together as kind of a historian of sorts?
I wrote it in chunks, originally in small vignettes of the memories that I do have that are sort of self-contained. And then I talked to my sister, who's very close in age to me, and really supported this essay. She said she likes it. She confirmed most of what I remember. So it's sort of like parallax, where the truth is somewhere in between of what I remember, what she remembers, and generally it matches up.
So you've shown the piece to your sister. Have your parents seen it?
My father has seen it. He saw a very, very first draft, which I actually wrote in 2018 during a nonfiction workshop during my grad school time. And he did not express like or dislike. He was very neutral about it. He said, "You wrote about it. That's great." He didn't really give me an opinion, but he didn't give me disapproval either, because, you know, this was the man, when I told him I was first going to write an essay and that I might submit it out there and that it was going to have some serious content about him, he said, "Well, I gave you my prison diary. It's yours to do with as you wish." So that was his sort of tacit, indirect approval.
That's great. How did you reconcile the events of the narrative in how you viewed them as a child and how you view them again as an adult?
I've spoken to a lot of my friends from childhood or young adult years, and I realized that we all have certain levels of dysfunction that we grew up with. And I realized that so many of us have survived different kinds of trauma. And part of life and growing up is just coming to terms with it and understanding how those experiences inform the person you are. Which is to say, for instance, when you confront your own flaws as an adult and you look back on why they came to be due to some of those, you know, traumatic experiences, you can still see that there's growth there, some positive growth there.
Mm-hmm. So beyond the deeply personal narrative and the family history here, you also have some really interesting cultural elements that are incorporated, with your mom being Korean and your dad being German, and you and your sister moving to the US and mostly growing up there.
Mm-hmm.
So can you talk about what was important for you to reflect in this piece and how you approached doing that?
I wanted to write as truthfully as possible, approach the, you know, the really like bones of it, the most painful part of it, because in a lot of East Asian cultures, silence is the way to go. There's such a history of trauma in Korea. My mother grew up in the 80s where Korea was still an unstable country. And so my grandparents were the generation that lived through the war and survived the war. And the coping mechanism that I think a lot of countries in that area developed were just bury the trauma, you know, like turn a new page. It doesn't matter what happened in the past, just move on. And I realized that is exactly what my parents had done with this particular incident that caused permanent, you know, brain damage in me. And I wanted to break that cycle, because you can't, it's not sustainable. It's not sustainable in long term. And writing about it was part of laying it bare and really bringing it out into the open and confronting the truth.
And if I heard you right before, you said you had a first draft in 2018, so it's taken you 7 years to really get this where you wanted it to be.
I workshopped this back in the University of Montana, and I laid it aside for a long time. I submitted it for my workshop, and I had a relatively polished draft. It looked fairly close to what you saw, to what Esme and Wang saw. And I didn't think I was going to submit it to many places. This was actually the only place I've ever submitted that particular essay. So I was shocked, to tell you the truth, and humbled. I'm very honored, very honored. But I didn't picture it ever being out there, to tell you the truth.
Well, we are so happy that you decided to do that, and that we can be the ones to put this out there in the world for you.
I'm hoping it resonates with some other people too. Epilepsy is such a misunderstood condition as well, because it frightens people when they see it, but it is an invisible illness. And so many people don't know the cause of why they have it. It feels so random. So in a way, me knowing exactly why I have epilepsy, how I got my diagnosis, that almost, when I talk to other epileptics, because I've talked to some, they're kind of envious of me in some ways, because I know exactly what caused it. I know how to talk about it and think about my epilepsy. It's not a big unanswered question for me.
Mm-hmm. Again, we are so thankful to be publishing your piece. We loved it. Esme loved it. And thank you for joining us. It was a pleasure to edit you and to speak with you.
This essay is about birds and mental illness. As a child, the first caged bird I remember was my grandmother's parakeet, a yellow-headed bird with a lime green belly and dappled yellow and black wings. The parakeet lived in the kitchen. Wood shavings of birdseed leaked from its cage and covered the countertops, which were never disinfected before lunch was assembled. A few times a day, my grandmother would saunter into the kitchen, open the cage, and stick her face against the parakeets, the two of them nuzzling beaks. My grandmother would laugh and throw her head back so you could see all her silver crowns. Then she would shut the cage and disappear into her bedroom to watch soaps or listen to books on tape. The bird, it seemed, was just there to be ogled after when my grandmother was in a playful mood. Most often, it spent its day squawking, pretty bird," as it stared at its friend in the mirror. My grandmother named her parakeet Palace Birdie, a riff on Palos Verde, the city in coastal Los Angeles County where she and my grandfather bought their first home, and where my mother and her two older brothers were born and lived for 10 years before the family moved to Arizona. The California house was at the end of a hill, a few blocks from the beach, and was filled with a variety of strange pets. My mother's older brother kept homing pigeons in the backyard that he often released far from home, clocking how long it took them to return to their coop. She also collected snakes and raised hermit crabs, as well as a guinea pig with a dislocated hip that lived longer than anyone expected. My grandmother rehabilitated baby birds and squirrels, usually fallen from nests, but sometimes confiscated from her Siamese cats, who brought them in to bat around. The most memorable animal in their home was a peachick, a tawny baby peacock that fell from their ceramic shingle roof during a flying lesson. While not native to California, peacocks have naturalized in the state, hundreds taking up residence in Los Angeles, where they're often considered a public nuisance. Their calls are sharp and deafening, and they have an appetite for almost anything that grows: roses, wildflowers, and nearly every garden shrub. They're also aggressive and will fiercely fight off birds that infringe on their territory. In driveways, confused by their own reflection, they will end up fighting themselves, sinking their beaks into shiny car siding and rearview mirrors, scratching paint and windows with their sharp claws. But peacocks are also magnificent. With their iridescent necks, feathered crowns, and dazzling plumage that cascades into enormous vibrating fans, it's no wonder so many people can overlook their bad qualities and fall in love. Flannery O'Connor was one such admirer. She kept more than 40 peacocks at the working dairy farm where she lived during the last decade of her life. Andalusia, it was called, a place where she wrote most of her body of work, living under the care of her mother as her lupus made it difficult to live elsewhere. Peacocks found their way into many of O'Connor's stories, often compared to a character with a disability or a character riddled with complexities. Despite her fascination and love of the birds, a love that allowed Peafowl to overrun her farm, she seemed to understand that the peacock's boisterous destructiveness, coupled with its jaw-dropping beauty, was part of its ambivalent charm. The peahens in my mother's childhood neighborhood used to teach their young to fly atop Californian ceramic roofs. A peahen would lead her chicks, leaping from roof to roof, beak clanging against orange clay shingles. On one such leap from my grandparents' roof, a pea chick vaulted its body but sank too soon, dropping into the brambles. My grandmother watched and waited, but when Mama Peahen didn't return, she carried the chick into the house and fed it blueberries and raisins for weeks. When she lost interest, and when it became too stressful to keep the birds away from her Siamese cats, she released it in a local park where other peafowl roosted. My grandmother has a bleeding heart for animals, but most of the pets from my mother's childhood seem to follow this narrative. They lived with their family for some time, and then they didn't. Before the move to California, my mother even had a pair of cats that weren't brought on the 8-hour car ride to their new home. Growing up, my mother seemed to feel a bit like my grandmother's pets. Like her mother wanted to interact sometimes, but at other times had no interest. I saw the way my mom lost interest in us when we were no longer babies, my mother told me. Sometimes I'd sit there and talk to her, and it'd be like talking to a blank wall. My mother often wonders whether her mother should have had children at all. I imagine that in my grandmother's youth, she wouldn't have had the space to even contemplate other choices. That's why I wasn't sure I ever wanted children, my mother said. Would I be the same? But she became the opposite. She threw elaborate birthday parties at our South Carolina home, took us camping, read to us every night. She spent summers watching us swim or hauling us to the zoo or paddling with us down the Saluda River. And then, in my late teens, when I suddenly found myself unable to drag myself from bed, she did it all over again. When anxiety caused me to spiral, she nurtured me. When I desperately needed someone to talk to, she would spend hours talking to me on the phone. When I didn't know why my chest felt like it wouldn't fill with air, she drove me to specialists and eventually therapists, sitting in her car for hours, just so I would go.
Thank you, Pia. Thank you, Alanna. And thank you, Liesel. Thank you to all the authors who participated in today's reading. Fiona Ennis and Chinaecherem Obor for fiction, Sandra, Dolores, Gomez, Amador, and Cedric Rudolph for poetry, Pia, Jee-Hae, Baur, and Liesel Hamilton for nonfiction. And thank you to BLR editors, Lauralee, Leonard, Saleem Penny, and Alanna Weissman. I want to add a special thank you to the Goldenberg and Buckfar families who sponsor BLR's fiction and nonfiction prizes, as well as to BLR board members Linda Lombardi and Lesma Fraser, who support the Allman Poetry Prize. Thank you to all the writers who contributed to BLR's 40th issue, and of course to all the BLR editors and reviewers who bring all this amazing writing to the page. Together, you've created this incredible assemblage of writing. Now, if you haven't gotten your copy of BLR yet, please visit us at blreview.org. You can browse BLR's previous events and read plenty of poems, essays, and stories. Better yet, we hope you'll join the BLR community as a subscriber. Your subscription helps nurture the writing you heard today and helps us continue to bring new writers to the table. Thank you so much, and we'll see you at the next event.